Hello again. All right, in this module, we're going to tackle permit required confined spaces. And there's a lot to it, so we are going to get with it. It is 1910.146 and permit required confined spaces. That's what makes this way different from just confined spaces. We'll talk about that. There's your sign that we'll need to have over confined space entered by permit only, something like that. And I don't know if that dude's in a confined space or not, but you'll know by the end of this video. And it's part of subpart J, General Environmental Controls. It's 1910.146, 147 lockout. So you can see that's a pretty important subpart. So I'm not going to read this whole thing, but basically it says the rail car service provider faces $551,000 in proposed penalties due to a confined space hazard fatality. The employee was asphyxiated in May of 2019 while servicing a rail car containing crude oil sludge. OSHA cited the company for 4 willful and 3 serious violations for failing to protect employees from the hazards of entering permit required confined spaces and inadequate respiratory protection procedures. OSHA has placed the company in its severe violator enforcement program. You don't want to be in the severe violator enforcement program. That means you're going to have OSHA down your neck all the time. And it's probably a good idea. $551,000 wasn't enough, but to get their attention, I guess. So they're going to be in that, and this is a good thing that OSHA does. So what's a confined space? What's a permit required confined space, or PRCS? In general conversation, sometimes these things mean the same thing. Permit required confined space, PRCS, and permit space. So we have confined space is one thing, and then a permit required confined space or a permit space or PRCS are all three of those mean the same thing. So a confined space is not always permit required. So there's a lot of confusion among the uninitiated regarding confined space and a permit required confined space. You see that picture there, something with a hatchet like that. That's more than likely going to be a confined space. The permit required, don't know yet. The safety professional must know the difference and how to deal with the PRCS. I guarantee you that people in management in your company are not going to know much about this. They're going to come to you for it. Now, the permit required confined space does not apply to agriculture, construction, or shipyard employment. So agriculture, construction, and shipyard. So a confined space means that it's large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter and perform work. So it's big enough to get into. So I've heard people say, oh, you get your hands there, it's confined space. And that is not true. You got to get your whole body in there for it to be a confined space. And I'm talking about a confined space. Has limited or restricted means for entry or exit. For example, tanks, vessels, silos, storage bins, hoppers, vaults, pits are spaces that may have limited means of entry and exit. So limited means, it doesn't mean one. But it means basically almost everything but just a regular door. And it's not designed for continuous human occupancy. So it's those three things. So ammonia compressor has an access door. It's about 12 inches in diameter, and the space inside is about 16 inches in diameter and 60 inches long. It was labeled permit required confined space. And was it? No, it's not, because it's not big enough to get into. So that's not even an issue, something that small. Okay, this is what happened with OK Foods when I first got there. Permit required confined space, permit space, or PRCS means a confined space. So you've already taken step one. Is it a confined space or not? So now that you've determined that it is a confined space, is it a permit required confined space? So it has to meet all three of the definitions of a confined space and only one of the following characteristics. Contains or has a potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. Contains a material that has the potential for engulfing an entrant. Has an internal configuration such that an entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls or by a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a smaller cross-section. Or, and here's OSHA's catch-all, contains any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. So it's a confined space that has any one of these. So remember that. You got to have all three of the confined space characteristics, but only one of the permanent required confined space characteristics to be a permanent required confined space. Mostly, it's usually a potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. In the case where they selected for cleaning some oil sludge, is that a potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere? Of course it is. Now remember, you already have determined that it's in a confined space. So if you have something like that out in the open, maybe not so much, but in a confined space, whole different ballgame. Potential for engulfing, that is usually, but not always, silos. Internal configuration, that happens. Not too often though. Any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. That could be anything that's a hazard. So asphyxiation is the leading cause of death in confined spaces. Oxygen deficient or toxic atmosphere, narrow tapering discharge pipes compress the torso, engulfment in fine particulate matter also is asphyxiation. This is just a cross section of a big air filtration room in the Orlando plant. And in this one, the air filled ducts came in like on the here, and this thing had a big filter around, and it went slowly, and it was big. It was a room you can get into, and it was about, I don't know, about as big as a classroom. And there was a door here, like a regular personnel door. So this probably didn't even qualify for a confined space, but it was kind of in that genre of it. And I was talking to the people, and this drum moved pretty slowly. And I was talking to the guys when they built it in. I said, this really isn't that big a hazard because it moves so slowly, because this drum here turns and these supports and it turn with it. And this is just a cross strut support here for support. And he said, well, they had a guy that went in this room while it was running and got caught between, as this thing turned, he got caught between this cross brace and that. And it doesn't go real fast and it doesn't go real hard, but it caught him in there, and it's noisy because all the airflow through it. And he suffocated. He couldn't breathe. He got caught in there. Didn't squash him, just he couldn't breathe, and he died. So even though maybe not a permanent required space per se, because of it has just a regular entry door in it, it probably should have been treated as one. So oxygen deficient atmospheres. Here's what happens at 19.5% is the minimum acceptable oxygen level. That's about where we're here. That's pretty close to where it's at, right? 19 to 20%. 15 to 19, decreased ability to work strenuously, impaired coordination, early symptoms, even at 15 or 19%. 12 to 14, respiration increases, poor judgment. 10 to 12, respiration increases again. Your lips start turning blue. You're not getting enough oxygen in your blood. 8 to 10%, mental failure, fainting, nausea, unconsciousness, vomiting. 6 to 8%, 8 minutes is fatal. 6 minutes, 50% fatal. 4 to 5 minutes, possible recovery. 4 to 6, coma in 40 seconds, and you're dead. So that's your oxygen levels, oxygen deficient atmospheres. Oxygen enriched atmospheres is above 21%, causes flammable and combustible materials to burn so violently when ignited, hair, clothing materials, etc., and oil-soaked clothing and materials. So it might not be enough to just burn of itself, but if it's something if there's an ignition, it will become more severe of a flame. Never use pure oxygen to ventilate. Never store or place compressed tanks in a confined space. Why? Because they could leak just a little bit, so little you wouldn't even notice it. But again, that's all exaggerated in a confined space. So why is an odorless, colorless gas dangerous? Pretty simple. You think you're breathing because you are breathing. You're breathing, inhaling something and exhaling something, but what you're inhaling doesn't have enough oxygen in it. And that's a big problem with confined spaces. You inhale it and you go and you pass out, and then minutes later you're dead. And the other person going in, they can't smell it, they can't see anything wrong. Oh, look, my buddy's down at the bottom of this thing. I'm going to go help him, and they get killed too. In fact, more entrants or potential rescuers are killed than initial entrants in confined spaces. So you don't want to go after somebody that's in a confined space. There's a reason that they're down there, lying down there, motionless. You don't want to be right beside them. Engulfment hazards: loose granular material stored in bins and hoppers, grains, sand, coal, etc. and crusting and bridging below a worker is common in feed silos. In other words, it builds up and it forms a broad crust at the top, and maybe bridging, you can actually walk under it, and they want to get down and walk it down. Bad thing to do. It could flooding of a confined space could be an engulfment hazard too, water or sewage flow. One of the biggest confined spaces probably is the sewer system is a confined space. And it is a permit required confined space most of the time because it has the potential for engulfment from water, food, sewage flow. Temperature extremes, extremely hot or cold temperatures, steam cleaning of confined spaces can cause that. Humidity factors are exacerbated because, again, no air moving. Extremely cold liquids. Work processes inside the confined space can increase temperature extremes, and personal protective equipment, if you're using some of that, that can make it hotter too. Another case study, this was a feed haul truck in Heavener, and this was, he wasn't an employee, he was a contract employee. But what happened was, this is like the inside of the feed truck. And there's an auger at the bottom, and the feed comes down the sides, and the auger turns and pushes it to the end of the truck and out. So he left his cell phone on the fender of his truck, went down into his truck to push the grain down or something, was caught, and with the auger running, and he lost his footing, whatever, and he got down there, and this auger took his leg off, all the way off, right about almost right halfway up through the thigh. Somehow he got out of his truck and called for help in 911 and survived, but obviously lost his leg. And I don't know what happened to him because he wasn't our employee, so we weren't involved in his recuperation or anything. So, but that's a shame. He went in his truck, and I mean, not real smart, but that happens. Other hazardous noise is amplified due to acoustics within the space. Could affect your hearing, or in effect also could affect communication. Slick or wet surfaces leading to slips and falls, or increased chance of electric shock. Drive shafts and gears could be in there. Falling objects, topside opening, expose workers inside confined space to falling objects. Products stored in confined spaces could lead to a toxic atmosphere. Gases releases when cleaning. Materials absorbed into walls. Decomposition of materials in the confined space could lead to a toxic atmosphere. The type of work you're doing, if you're doing any welding, cutting, brazing, or soldering, that's going to create heat, and it's going to eat up the oxygen in the space. Painting, scraping, sanding, degreasing, same thing. You're putting a lot of bad atmospheres with degreasing and painting. Sealing, bonding, melting, all that stuff going to give you some toxic atmospheres. And maybe out on your back porch might be okay, but in a confined space, it makes it so much worse. And there could be areas adjacent to a confined space that has exhaust pumps, generators, or something in it too. So be very careful. By their very nature configuration, many permit required confined spaces contain atmospheres that, unless adequate precautions are taken, are IDLH, immediately dangerous to life and health. Or I don't live here. Other causes of death in confined spaces: auger type conveyors, rotating parts inside mixers. Confinement and restricted airflow can result in hazardous atmospheres that would not originate in an open workspace. Failure to take proper precautions. Little consideration given to a space that's not designed for continuous human occupancy. In other words, nobody works there all the time, so you think about it, nobody thinks about it till it's too late. So here's 146C1. Evaluate the workplace to determine if any spaces are permit required. And there's a flow chart. We'll look at it later. If the workplace contains permit spaces, you need to inform exposed employees by posting danger signs or by any other equally effective means of the existence and location of the danger posed by the permit spaces. Permit spaces means permit required confined space, PRCS. So a sign reading danger, permit required confined space, do not enter, or other similar language would satisfy the requirement for a sign. Now it says by any other equally effective means. And so in the sewer systems, it's not really feasible for them to put a sign on every sewer. I mean, most of them are out in the snow on the street, right? So they get around that by extensive training of all the people that work in the sewers. If employers decide that its employees will not enter permit required confined spaces, they will comply with these 3 sections. And boy, I would strongly suggest, if it's at all possible, you do not have your employees enter permit required confined spaces. And you'll find out why when we get into the meat and potatoes of this thing. So if you decide that they won't, okay, you have permit required confined space, and you're going to say, we're not going to go in them. Okay, what are you going to do about them if you need to? Or are you going to hire an outside contractor with experience and equipment to go in them? So you have to do the evaluation, make sure that you've done that of all the places. You have to post a danger sign, like I mentioned in the previous slide. And then covers reclassifying a confined space to a permit required confined space if there are changes to it. So you have to make sure if there's any changes to it, you might have to reclassify it. And this covers when a host employer arranges to have contract employees work in a permit required confined space. And you have to take effective measures to prevent its employees from entering the permit spaces. So you have a permit required confined space that you're not going to go into. You need to put the signs up. You also need to make sure that they don't go in there. How do you do that? Well, a good place would be to put a lock on it. If that's not possible, make sure they're all trained about it. They know what those signs mean. If the employer decides that employees will enter permit required confined spaces, the employer shall develop and implement a written permit space program that complies with this section 29 CFR 1910.146, permit required confined spaces. And it's extensive. This written program shall be available for inspection by employees and their authorized representatives. So the employer may use alternate procedures specified in paragraph C5II of this section for entering a permit space under the conditions set forth in paragraph C5I of this section, which we haven't got to yet, provided that the employer can demonstrate that the only hazard posed by the permit space is an actual or potential hazardous atmosphere. The employer demonstrates that continuous forced air ventilation alone is sufficient to maintain that permit space for safe entry. And the employer develops monitoring and inspection data that supports these demonstrations A and B above. So again, the alternate procedure is if it's the only hazard is a potentially hazardous atmosphere, and you can demonstrate that continuous forced air ventilation alone is enough to keep it safe, and you develop inspection and monitoring data that supports it, then you can get around it. Now, CID, if an initial entry of the permit space is necessary to obtain the data required in the previous paragraph, the entry is performed in compliance with paragraphs D through K of this section. The determinations and supporting data required by paragraph C5IA and BC of this section are documented by the employer and are made available to each employee who enters the permit space under the terms of paragraph C5 of this section or to that employee's authorized representative. So again, A, B, and C were C5A was that when you're entering with forced air. Okay. Where am I? Get messed up. Okay, there we go. All right. If entry into the permit space under the terms of paragraph C5I of this section is performed in accordance with the requirements of C5II of this section. This section lists the requirements that must be met to enter the space under these alternate procedures. Since paragraph C5IA requires that the only hazard posed in this space is actual potential hazardous atmosphere, these requirements mostly involve air monitoring, among other things that are quite extensive. A space classified as a PRCS may be reclassified so it's classified as a permit required confined space, but it may be reclassified if the space poses no actual or potential hazards, and if all hazards within the space are eliminated without entry into the space. For example, maybe like an air compressor in there had a belt on it and it wasn't guarded. There's a hazard in there from that, and you can lock it out from outside the space. You can reclassify the space. Doesn't happen very often. If it's necessary to enter the space to eliminate hazards, such entry shall be performed in accordance with this section. Space may remain classified as long as the hazards remain eliminated, reclassified. Forced air ventilation does not constitute elimination of the hazards. So forced air ventilation just won't let you permanently reclassify it. The employer must document the basis for determining that all hazards in a permit space have been eliminated through a certification that contains a date, location of the space, and signature of the person entering the space. Now, a lot of times, OSHA will do this, and they'll do it here. And that's just to make sure that if they're going to do this, somebody is going to put their name and their signature on it. So if it comes down to it, they're going to take responsibility for it. They're going to be responsible for it. They signed it. Certification shall be made available to each employee entering the space or to that employee's authorized representative. If hazards arise with such a space, if hazards arise with such a space, each employee in the space shall exit the space and it must be reevaluated. So if you get hazards after you've all done this, you've got to reevaluate. Okay, the host employer, now this is the contractors and host duties. Inform the contractor, this is the host, this doesn't mean if it's your business, you bring in somebody else. Inform the contractor that the workplace contains PRCSs and entry is allowed only in compliance with the Section 146. Apprise the contractor of the elements, including the hazards identified and the host's experience with the space that makes the space PRCS. Apprise the contractor of any precautions or procedures that the host has implemented for the protection of employees in or near PRCSs where contractor is working. And coordinate entry operation with the contractor when both host and contractor employees will be working in or near PRCSs as required by D11. Oops. To debrief the contractor at the conclusion of the entry operations regarding the permit space program followed and regarding any hazards confronted or created in permit spaces during entry operations. In addition to complying with requirements that apply to all employers, each contractor who is retained to perform at permit space entry operations shall obtain any available information regarding permit space hazards and entry operations from the host, coordinate entry operation with the host when both will be working in or near permit space, inform host employer of the permit space program they will follow, and if any hazards confronted or created in permit space, either in a debriefing or during entry. So they both have to communicate about this thing. The employer shall implement the measures necessary to prevent unauthorized entry. Identify and evaluate the hazards of permit spaces before employees enter them. Develop and implement the means, procedures, and practices necessary for safe permit space entry operations, including but not limited to the following: specifying acceptable entry conditions, providing each authorized entrant or that employee's authorized representative with the opportunity to observe any monitoring or testing of permit spaces. So if you're going to throw a 4-gas meter down there, you're going to put one down there, and the employee has the right, and his representative has a right to look at that, look at it. That makes sense. You shouldn't be doing anything clandestine if you're doing this type of thing. And implement procedure, I want to talk about here, develop and implement the procedures for isolating the permit space. Purging, inerting, flushing, let's see, we're at here. Oh, 3 purging, inerting, flushing, or ventilating the permit space as necessary to eliminate or control atmospheric hazards. Providing pedestrian, vehicle, or other barriers as necessary to protect entrants from external hazards. Verifying the conditions of the permit space are acceptable for entry throughout the duration of an authorized entry. In other words, this isn't a case where you do it once and say, okay, it's good. You guys go ahead in. I'm done, going home. And it ain't the way it works. You got to make sure it's done through the duration of the entry. Provide the following equipment specified in paragraphs D4I through D4IX of this section at no cost to employees. Maintain that equipment properly and ensure that employees use that equipment properly. So testing and monitoring equipment needed to comply with paragraph D5. Ventilating equipment needed to obtain acceptable entry conditions. Communications equipment necessary to comply for compliance with paragraphs H3 and I5 of this section. Personal protective equipment, insofar as feasible, engineering and work practice controls do not adequately protect employees. So there they are. They're taking a little chunk of the hierarchy controls and saying engineering controls and administrative controls don't adequately protect employees. They're going to use PPE. They're just following the hierarchy controls. Lighting equipment needed to enable employees to see well enough to work safely and to exit the space quickly in an emergency. Barriers and shields as required by paragraph D3V of this section. D4 VII, equipment such as ladders needed for safe ingress and egress by authorized entrance. Rescue and emergency equipment needed to comply with paragraph D9 of this section, except to the extent that equipment is provided by rescue services and any other equipment necessary for safe entry into and rescue from permit spaces. So all this stuff has to be taken care of, but in good shape. Evaluate permit space conditions as follows when entry operations are conducted. Test conditions in a permit space to determine if acceptable entry conditions exist before entry is authorized to begin, except that if isolation of the space is infeasible because the space is large or is part of a continuous system such as a sewer, pre-entry testing shall be performed to the extent feasible before entry is authorized, and if entry is authorized, entry conditions shall be continuously monitored in the areas where authorized entrants are working. And I think continuous monitoring is a good idea, no matter what the conditions are. Test or monitor the permit space as necessary to determine if acceptable entry conditions are being maintained during the course of entry operations. Remember, on your permit, you're going to have to put what these entry conditions are, and they have to be maintained during the entire course of the entry operations. With testing for atmospheric hazards, test first for oxygen, then for combustible gases and vapors, and then for toxic gases and vapors. Provide each authorized entrant or that employee's authorized representative an opportunity to observe the pre-entry and any subsequent testing or monitoring of permit spaces. Now, this is in a lot of OSHA regulations, and that's a good thing too, because if you're doing something that's going to be where somebody's life's going to depend on it, you better not be doing it on the sly and not let people look at it. I mean, why would you be doing that? The only reason why you'd be doing that is because there's something wrong. So you should, by all means, feel free, let them look at it. People are going to go in someplace that's going to be dangerous. Reevaluate the permit space in the presence of any authorized entrant or that employee's authorized representative who requests that the employer conduct such reevaluation because the entrant or representative has reason to believe that the evaluation of that space may not have been adequate. This is unusual in OSHA. You're going to say if the entrant or the employee's authorized representative, and again, that's usually the union, they can request that the employer they reevaluate it. And you don't have that very often in OSHA. That's how important this is. Immediately provide each authorized entrant or that employee's authorized representative with the results of any testing conducted in accordance with paragraph D. Note, atmospheric testing conducted in accordance with Appendix B to Section 1910.146 would be considered as satisfying the requirements of this paragraph. For permit space operations in sewers, atmospheric testing conducted in accordance with Appendix B, as supplemented by Appendix E, would be considered as satisfying the requirements of this paragraph. So you can see how extensive this is getting here. Provide at least one attendant outside the permit space in which entry is authorized for the duration of entry operations. The attendant is an important person in this. Note, attendants may be assigned to monitor more than one permit space, provided the duties described in paragraph I of this section can be effectively performed for each permit space that is monitored. Likewise, attendants may be stationed at any location outside the permit space to be monitored, as long as the duties prescribed in paragraph I of this section can be effectively performed for each permit space that is monitored. Now, they can let you do that, but I wouldn't do it if I were you. I would have one attendant. It's important enough. They're going into a permit required confined space. By definition, that means it has a hazard or something, a potential hazard. So it's a case where something could go wrong very easily. I would have one attendant, but you're allowed to have more than one, provided they can do it right, effectively. Yeah, I wouldn't do it. If multiple spaces are to be monitored by a single attendant, including the permit program, the means and procedures to enable the attendant to respond to an emergency affecting one or more of the permit spaces being monitored without distraction from the attendant's responsibilities under paragraph I of this section. And I don't think you can serve two masters here. Not a good idea. Designate the persons who are to have active roles, as for example, authorized entrants, attendants, entry supervisors, or persons who test or monitor the atmosphere in a permit space in entry operations identify the duties of each such employee, and provide each such employee with training required by paragraph G of this section. So here's the people you have rules in this thing. You have authorized entrance. Those people who are going in, they're going to enter it. Attendance, those are people who are staying out, and they're going to be checking. They're attending to it. Entry supervisor, the one's going to make sure everything is copacetic. They're going to sign off on it. And then you have people that are testing or monitoring the atmosphere in the permanent space. So you have a lot of different people involved in a permanent required confined space. Develop and implement procedures for summoning, rescue, and emergency services, for rescuing entrants from permanent spaces, for providing necessary emergency services to rescue employees, and to prevent unauthorized personnel from attempting a rescue. Prevent unauthorized personnel from attempting a rescue. I talked about earlier, more rescuers die in confined spaces than entrants. So that happens a lot. So you have to have procedures for doing this. All right, we have a problem. How are we going to summon rescue emergency services? Radio, phone, whatever. I noticed at the casino, which I probably go too often, they have some like manhole covers, and they have a crane, a hoist built up there, like kind of like this, over that. And I'm bet that's what that's for. That is to, somebody goes down in there, it's a confined space. They're going to put a harness on them. They're going to hook them up to this thing so they have a retrieval system to get them out. Great idea. Glad to see something like that happening. Develop and implement a system for the preparation, issuance, use, and cancellation of entry permits as required by this section. So you got to have a system for all this stuff. Develop and implement procedures to coordinate entry operations when employees of more than one employer are working simultaneously as authorized entrants in a permit space, so that employees of one employer do not endanger the employees of any other employer. This could happen, though it happens, you got to communicate. Develop and implement procedures such as closing off a permit space and canceling the permit necessary for conducting the entry after entry operations have been completed. You got to have a procedure for that. This doesn't happen automatically. Review entry operations when the employer has reason to believe that the measures taken under the permit space program may not protect employees, and revise the program to correct deficiencies found to exist before subsequent entries are authorized. So if you have reason to believe that the measures taken aren't adequate, then you need to revise it. Examples of circumstances requiring the review of the permit space program are any unauthorized entry of a permit space, the detection of a permit space hazard not covered by the permit, the detection of a condition prohibited by the permit, the occurrence of an injury or near miss during entry, a change in the use or configuration of a permit space, and employee complaints about the effectiveness of the program. That happens, you may need to revise the program to correct deficiencies. Review the permit space program using the canceled permits retained under paragraph E6 of this section within 1 year after each entry, and revise the program as necessary to ensure that employees participating in entry operations are protected from permit space hazards. Note, employers may perform a single annual review covering all entries performed during a 12-month period. If no entry is performed during a 12-month period, no review is necessary. Appendix C to this section presents examples of permit space programs that are considered to comply with the requirements of paragraph D of this section. Permit system. Before entry is authorized, the employer shall document the completion of measures required by paragraph D3 of this section by preparing an entry permit. Okay, here's where the permit part of permit required space comes in. Appendix D represents examples of permits whose elements are considered to comply with the requirements of this section. Before the entry begins, the entry supervisor identified on the permit shall sign the entry permit to authorize entry. Now, this is before the entry begins. There's all kind of other stuff that happens before entry begins. But before it happens, the entry supervisor has to sign it, saying they are allowing these people to go into this potentially hazardous place. So that's a lot of responsibility. And if you're going to do that, or whoever's going to do it, they need to know what they're doing. They need to be trained, and they need to know what they're doing as far as they're signing this people off to go in this place. It's a big responsibility. The completed permit shall be made available at the time of entry to all authorized entrants or their authorized representatives by posting it at the entry portal or by any other equally effective means, so the entrants can confirm that the pre-entry preparations have been completed. So this permit's got to be posted, or other equally effective means. The duration of the permit may not exceed the time required to complete the assigned task or job identified on the permit. So in accordance with paragraph F2. So you're gonna say how much time you're supposed to be in there. So the entry supervisor shall terminate entry and cancel the entry permit. The entry supervisor now. When the entry operations covered by the entry permit have been completed, when you're done with it, you're going to cancel the permit. A condition that is not allowed under the entry permit arises in or near the permit space. The entry supervisor has to cancel that permit. The employer shall return each canceled entry permit for at least 1 year to facilitate the review of the permit required confined space program required by paragraph D14 of this section. Any problems encountered during entry operations shall be noted on the pertinent permit so that appropriate revisions of the permit space can be made. Now, this is retain each canceled entry permit. So you have a supervisor that something that starts to go wrong and they cancel that permit and do another one. You still have to retain that other canceled permit too for at least a year because they have to be reviewed. It's a good idea. This is a very important program, and there's a lot of factors go into it that and there's a reason for it. The entry permit that documents compliance with the section and authorized entry to permit space shall identify the permit space to be entered. It's not a blanket. You can, okay, we're going to go here. We're going to go. Why we're going in there, purpose of it, the date and the duration of the entry permit, the authorized entrance within the permit space by name or by such other means, for example, through the use of rosters or tracking systems, as will enable the attendant to determine quickly and accurately for the duration of the permit which authorized entrants are inside the permit space. So it's got to be a good enough program that you have here or system that the entrant has to be able to know who's in there. And that's very important. This requirement may be met by inserting a reference on the entry permit as to the means used, such as a roster or tracking system to keep track of the authorized entrants within the permit space. The personnel by name currently serving as attendants, the individual by name currently serving as entry supervisor with a space for the signature or initials of the entry supervisor who originally authorized entry, the hazards of the permit space to be entered, they have to be on the permit, the measures used to isolate the permit space and to eliminate or control permit space hazards before entry. Note, those measures can include the lockout or tagging of equipment and procedures for purging, inerting, ventilating, and flushing permit spaces. The acceptable entry conditions has to be on the permit. The results of initial and periodic tests performed under paragraph D5 of this section, accompanied by the names or initials of the testers and by an indication of when the tests were performed. In other words, you got to write it down. Write your times down when you did these tests and the person who did the tests. The rescue and emergency services that can be summoned and the means, such as the equipment to use and the numbers to call for summoning those services. The communication procedures used by authorized entrants and attendants to maintain contact during the entry. All got to be in the permit. Equipment such as personal protective equipment, testing equipment, communications equipment, alarm systems, and rescue equipment to be provided for compliance with this section. And the other information whose inclusion is necessary given the circumstances of the particular confined space in order to ensure employee safety. Now there's one a good OSHA catch-all thing. They're going to say, all right, anything else too. So just in case there's something that comes up, because it's everything, not everyone is different, but confined space entry could be just for so many different ways or so many different things. So they put a catch-all in there. And 15, any additional permits, such as for hot work, but issued to authorize work in the permit space. So you might have to go into confined space and do hot work. You might need a hot work permit too. Training. The employer shall provide training so that all employees whose work is regulated by this section acquire the understanding, knowledge, and skills necessary for the safe performance of the duties assigned under this section. Training shall be provided to each affected employee. Okay, now before the employee is first assigned duties under this section, before there's a change in assigned duties, whenever there is a change in permit space operations that present a hazard about which an employee has not previously been trained, whenever the employer has reason to believe either that there are deviations from the permit space entry procedures required by paragraph D3 of this section, or that there are inadequacies in the employee's knowledge of the procedures. So you can see these are similar to most requirements, but with a little bit of difference because this is so specific. The training shall establish employee proficiency in the duties required by this section and shall introduce new or revised procedures as necessary for compliance with this section. The employer shall certify that the training required by paragraph G1 through G3 of this section, which we just talked about, has been accomplished. The certification shall contain each employee's name, the signatures or initials of the trainers, and the dates of the training. The certification shall be available for inspection by employees and their authorized representatives. Duties of authorized entrance. Now we're going to talk about the duties of each of these people we talked about before. The employer shall assure that all authorized entrants know the hazards that may be faced during entry, including information on the mode, signs, or symptoms and consequences of the exposure. That is important. They need to know what's going to happen if somebody is exposed to this potentially hazardous atmosphere that's in there. They need to know that there's signs of somebody starts talking funny or something like that. It's okay. They can cancel this thing and get everybody out. Properly use equipment as required by paragraph D4. And that's a whole list of equipment we mentioned here earlier. Oh, here it is. Testing and monitoring equipment, ventilation equipment, communications equipment, personal protective equipment, lighting equipment, barriers and shields. That's the entrant has to know all about this. Ladders, rescue and emergency equipment, any other equipment necessary for safe entry and rescue from permit spaces. So the entrants communicate with the attendant. Now this is the entrance now, the entrance, not the entrance, like a door, entrance, people that are going to enter. Communicate with the attendant as necessary to enable the attendant to monitor entrance status and to enable the attendant to alert entrants of the need to evacuate the space as required by I6 of this section. Then the entrant has to alert the attendant whenever the entrant recognizes any warning sign or symptom of exposure to a dangerous situation. So if you're an entrant and you feel like you're getting drowsy or might be something wrong, you know, let the attendant know. The entrant detects a prohibited condition that's on the permit and exit from the permit space as quickly as possible whenever an order to evacuate is given. So this, the entrants have to exit as quickly as possible whenever an order is given to evacuate by the attendant or the entry supervisor. The entrant recognizes any warning sign or symptom of exposure to a dangerous situation. The entrant detects a prohibited condition or an evacuation alarm is activated. You need to do one thing, get out as quickly as possible. The attendance, duties of attendance. Now, the employer shall ensure that each attendant, now those we talked about before, the entrants, that was the people that were inside it. But the attendant has to know the hazards that may be faced during entry, including information on the mode, signs, or symptoms, and consequences of the exposure. So they have to know too, if the potential is there for a hazardous atmosphere, they need to know what the entrants are going to do if they're exposed to it. Are they going to get groggy? Are they going to get slurred speech or whatever, like some whatever? Is aware of possible behavioral effects of hazard exposure in an authorized authorized entrance. That's what I just said, kind of. Continuously maintains an accurate count of authorized entrants in the permit space and ensures that the means used to identify authorized entrants under paragraph F4 of the section accurately identifies who is in the permit space. The attendant has to know who's in there at all times. Remains outside the permit space during entry operations until relieved by another attendant. Note, when the employer's permit entry program allows attendant entry for rescue, attendants may enter a permit space to attempt the rescue if they have been trained and equipped for rescue operations, if they have been as required by K1 of the section, and if they have been relieved as required by paragraph I4, which is right there, section. So if the attendant is going to be a rescuer, then they have to have another attendant have to take the place. Communicates with authorized entrants as necessary to monitor entrance status and to alert entrants of the need to evacuate the space under paragraph I6 of this section, which is this one. Monitors activities inside and outside the space to determine if it's safe for entrants to remain in the space and orders the authorized entrants to evacuate the space immediately under any of the following conditions. If the attendant defects a prohibited condition, remember the permit has conditions on it. If any of those are the prohibited conditions, When those happen, time to get out. If the attendant detects the behavioral effects of hazard exposure in an authorized entrance, if the attendant detects a situation outside the space that could endanger the authorized entrance, or if the attendant cannot effectively and safely perform all the duties required under paragraph I of the section. The attendant's duties, summon rescue and other emergency services as soon as the attendant determines that authorized entrance may need assistance to escape from permanent space hazards. Takes the following actions when unauthorized persons approach or enter a permit space while entry is underway. So you're the attendant, you're outside the space, everything's going fine, and now somebody shows up that's unauthorized. So I need to warn the unauthorized persons they got to stay away from the permit space. The first thing you do is tell them. Advise the unauthorized person they must exit immediately if they have entered the permit space, and inform the authorized entrance and the entry supervisor if unauthorized persons have entered the permit space. Why somebody would go in there, I don't know. But people being what they are, who knows? So that's what the attendant has to do if somebody tries to go in there. Performs non-entry rescues as specified by the employer's rescue procedure. Non-entry rescues. That's what I was talking about, the hoist over the manhole cover. Great idea. So frequently, especially if it's a limited number of people going in, one person's in there, you have a harness on with a D-ring on the back, and or sometimes the wrists too. But the non-entry rescue, I mean, you just crank them out of there. That's the best way to do it. So it performs no duties. The attendant can perform no duties that might interfere with the attendant's primary duty to monitor and protect the authorized entrance. Duties of entry supervisors. The employer shall ensure that each entry supervisor knows the hazards that may be faced during entry, including information on the mode, signs, or symptoms and consequences of the exposure. Verifies by checking that the appropriate entries have been made on the permit, that all tests specified by the permit have been conducted, and that all procedures and equipment specified by the permit are in place before endorsing the permit, allowing entry to begin. Terminates the entry and cancels the permit as required by paragraph E5 of this section. Verifies that rescue services are available and that the means for summoning them are operable. Removes unauthorized individuals who enter or who attempt to enter the permit space during operations, and determines whenever responsibility for a permit space entry operation is transferred and at intervals dictated by the hazards and operations performed within the space, that entry operations remain consistent with terms of the entry permit and that acceptable entry conditions are maintained. Supervisor has a lot of responsibilities. Now, rescue, an employee who designates rescue and emergency services pursuant to paragraph D9 of the section shall evaluate a prospective rescuer's ability to respond to a rescue summons in a timely manner, considering the hazards identified. Note the paragraph. What will be considered timely will vary according to the specific hazards involved in each entry. For example, 19.134, respiratory protection requires that employers provide a standby person or persons capable of immediate action to rescue employees wearing respiratory protection while in work areas defined as IDLH atmospheres. Evaluate a prospective rescue services ability in terms of proficiency with rescue-related tasks and equipment to function appropriately while rescuing entrants from the particular permit space or types of permit space identified. Select a rescue team or service from those evaluated that A, has the capability to reach the victims within a time frame that is appropriate for the permit space hazards identified, or B, is equipped for and proficient in performing the needed rescue services. Inform each rescue team or service of the hazards they may confront when called on to perform rescue at the site. Provide the rescue team or service selected with access to all permit spaces from which rescue may be necessary so that the rescue service can develop appropriate rescue plans and practice rescue operations. Note to paragraph K1, non-mandatory appendix F contains examples of criteria which employers can use in evaluating prospective rescuers. So that look at V there. You got to provide the rescue team. So if you ever rescue somebody that you've designated as your team, somebody maybe an outside contractor that you've called on, or maybe as a team provided by the contractor that's coming on site, they may have their own rescue team. You have to let them have access to your all permit spaces, which they may need to practice, and so they make sure they know what's going on. It can be very important. An employer whose employees have been designated to provide permit space rescue and emergency services shall take the following measures. Now, this if your employees are going to do the rescue. Provide effective employees with the personal protective equipment needed to conduct permit space rescues safely and train affected employees so they are proficient in the use of that PP at no cost to those employees. Train affected employees to perform assigned rescue duties. The employer must ensure that such employees successfully complete the training required to establish proficiency as an authorized entrant as provided by paragraph G and H of this section. So they also has to be an entrant. Train affected employees in basic first aid and CPR. The employer shall ensure that at least one member of the rescue team or service holding a current certification in first aid and CPR is available, and ensure that every affected employees practice making permit space rescues at least once every 12 months by means of simulated rescue operations in which they remove dummies, mannequins, or actual persons from the actual permit spaces or from representative permit spaces. Representative permit spaces shall, with respect to opening size, configuration, and accessibility, simulate the types of permit spaces from which rescue is to be performed. So if you're going to have your own crew, they got to be doing rescue operations or practice every 12 months on simulated rescue operations on spaces that are pretty doggone close, if not exactly better than the exact places they're going to be needing to do it on. To facilitate non-entry rescue, retrieval systems or methods shall be used whenever an authorized entrant enters permit space, unless the retrieval equipment would increase the overall risk of entry or would not contribute to the rescue of the entrant. Retrieval systems shall meet the following requirements. Each authorized entrant shall use a chest or full body harness with a retrieval line attached at the center of the entrant's back, near shoulder level, above the entrant's head, or at another point which the employer can establish that presents a profile small enough for the successful removal of the entrant. Wristlets may be used in lieu of the chest or full body harness if the employer can demonstrate that the use of a chest or full body harness or isn't feasible or creates a greater hazard and that the use of wristlets is the safest and most effective alternative. Why wristlets? Because if that's the case, the wristlets, you're going to go out like this with your hands up, and it's probably going to be a lot easier to get you through a manhole, especially if you're a big person. The other end of the retrieval line shall be attached to a mechanical device or fixed point outside the permit space in such a manner that rescue can begin as soon as the rescuer becomes aware that rescue is necessary. A mechanical device, this is important, shall be available to retrieve personnel from vertical type permit spaces more than 5 feet deep. A mechanical device, a hoist necessary. It could be a hand crank hoist, it could be a motorized hoist, but it should be available to retrieve personnel from a vertical type permit space more than 5 feet deep. So if it's on a horizontal level or not 5 feet deep, you can just have people cranking that line in. But if it's more than 5 feet, then you need some mechanical help. It makes a lot of sense. If an injured entrant is exposed to a substance for which a safety data sheet or other similar written information is required to be kept at the work site, that SDS or written information shall be made available to the medical facility treating the exposed entrant. SDS is a very important part of any safety program. Employee participation. Employers shall consult with affected employees and their authorized representatives on development and implementation of all aspects of the permit space program required by paragraph C of this section. Employers shall make available to all affected employees and their authorized representatives all information required to be developed by this section. So what 3 conditions are required to make something a confined space? We're going to kind of go over this just a little bit. It's large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter before assigned work. So it's big enough to get into, has limited or restricted means for entry or exit, and that's either one of those. It's not designed for continuous human occupancy. That's the 3 things that make something a confined space. So now of the 3, how many of these 3 conditions must be present to make something a confined space? All 3 of them. Now, what are the 4 conditions that make something a permit required confined space? Contains or has a potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. Contains a material that has the potential for engulfing an entrant. Has an internal configuration such that an entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls or by a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a small cross section, or contains any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. How many of these 4 conditions must be present in order to make a confined space a permit required confined space? Any one. Only one of them needs to be there, and then it's a permit required confined space. What's the difference between a permit required confined space, a permit space, and a PRCS? Not a bit. They're all the same thing. What must all employees do first? So that's the same. You bought a company, your company bought another company or something like, or you go to work for a company and maybe you haven't had a safety person before. What's the first thing you're going to do? Evaluate the workplace to determine if any spaces are permit required. Use the flowchart appendix A, and we'll talk about that when I get my voice back. If the workplace contains permit spaces, what must the employer do? Post each PRCS with a sign, danger, permit required confined space, do not enter, or similar language. And if it decides that employees will not enter any permit required confined spaces, they'll comply with these sections. Still do the evaluation, still post the danger signs, and reclassify them. There's changes to it, and it covers when a host employer, you still have to talk to the host employer if you have them come up there, and you have to take effective measures to prevent its employees from entering the permit spaces. What are those effective measures? Depends on the space. Could be a lock. There won't be a quote lockout, unquote. It's not lockout, but just put a lock on it, put signs on it, different ways. Train your people. If an employer decides that employees will enter permit required confined spaces, the employer shall develop and implement a written permit space program that complies with this section, permit required confined spaces. And as you can see, it is quite extensive. The written program shall be available for inspection by employees and their authorized representatives. A space classified as a PRCS may be classified as just a confined space if the space poses no actual or potential hazards, and if all hazards within the space are eliminated without entry into the space. It's necessary to enter the space to eliminate hazards, and you got to enter in accordance with the standard. Space remain classified as long as the hazards remain eliminated. Forced air ventilation does not constitute elimination of the hazards. What knowledge must all those involved in entry, entrance, attendants, and entry supervisors have? They all have to know the hazards that may be faced during entry, including information on the mode, signs, or symptoms and consequences of the exposure. And that's all, folks. That wasn't enough. There's a lot to this program, and we are still going to be on it because there's a lot more things we're going to cover in this. So I hope you never have to have a confined space program. But if you do, make it a good one because people's lives will depend on it.